Good afternoon, bon après-midi, buenas tardes. Welcome. I would like to introduce you to Mark Rosegrant, the Director of the Environment and Production Technology Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute.
Thanks, Emil. Yeah, I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to the session, and then we'll start turning it over to the main speakers. So it's probably everyone in this room knows that the current scenarios looking forward on the impact of climate change on agriculture show slower yield growth and rising food prices even by 2050 under climate change. If you're looking at maize production, it could be as much as 20 to 30% lower in 2050 under climate change than under a no climate change scenario. Other crops run 10 to 20% lower under climate change compared to a no climate change scenario. The worst hit in most cases are going to be developing countries, regions of the world where, of course, food security is already problematic and populations are more vulnerable to shocks and have fewer resources to address those shocks. So without substantial measures that address the challenges and the ability to adapt to climate change, the losses in crop and livestock productivity are going to hit hard in developing countries. Climate change is not only threatening productivity, but we also see increasing variability in weather that has significant consequences on a wide range of ecosystem services and the resilience of peoples. One approach that we're trying to implement at IFPRI and with collaborators around the world is to create a responsive institutional environment, is to try to establish decision support tools and models for agricultural, climate change, and food security policies that use new and easily updatable and open data, customizable modeling output, and innovative scenarios assessments. Modeling environments that we're working on, we're trying to design to integrate seamlessly into national government development programs and processes such as planning, project evaluation, and investment programming. In this discussion forum, we are going to focus on some of our recent work in this area to develop these kinds of tools and analysis. And we'll show results here from work at both global, regional, and country levels that would promote healthy growth for agriculture in a changing climate. The economic implications of changing climate conditions, and very importantly, the potential for specific policies and investments to address climate change and reduce the negative impacts of climate change are going to be evaluated and shown here using examples both from global assessments, but also from developing country assessments, including work in the Philippines, Colombia, Vietnam, and Central Asia. So with that, I'll turn it over to Emil to introduce the other speakers.
Thank you, Mark. I'd like to introduce Keith Wiebe, Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI. So, hello, Keith.
You just click. Okay. Thanks, Emil. There we go. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. Climate change has the potential to affect all of us at multiple scales, nearby and in the present, far away and in the future, individually and collectively. And I'd like to start the session this afternoon by taking a global and regional perspective on the impacts of climate change on agriculture, which provides employment and income to many of the world's poorest people, and which of course provides food to all 7.5 billion of us as consumers. The projections that I'll be sharing this afternoon come from collaborative work led by IFPRI, but in partnership with all 15 of the CGIAR centers around the world, and also with other global modeling groups through the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. We bring together a diverse set of skills, data, and models that combine assumptions about population growth, income growth, technological change, climate, very importantly, and bring these together and model how those affect crop production through crop models as well as through water models, and pull it together in a global partial equilibrium economic model, the impact model, which was developed at IFPRI. And we do so in a as disaggregated as possible a manner in over 300 production regions around the world and modeling around 60 agricultural commodities. So in looking at climate change, of course, we have to start with assumptions about how rapidly climate will change. We don't do the climate modeling ourselves, but we take those results from climate modeling work done by others. And those, of course, can span a range of assumptions from relatively optimistic, slow climate change, which has already been basically disproven because we've changed already significantly in the past decade, the past half century, the past century. But those range to more moderate rates of climate change to more extreme rates of climate change. But while we look at those different scenarios represented by different representative concentration pathways, we also have to look at different assumptions about how the world will change independent of climate change. Because we want to, if we're looking at what the world will look like in 2050, we can't compare a future climate with the technology or the population or the incomes that we have today. We have to look and anticipate what those might look like in mid-century. And what I'm going to be looking and describing today is focused on 2050. But of course, as you can see here, not only the potential impacts, but the uncertainty and the range of those impacts increases more significantly after mid-century. Most of what I'll be talking about assumes a middle-of-the-road rate of change in population and income. That's so-called shared socioeconomic pathway 2. And I'll talk about some results without climate change and some results with a relatively high level of climate change represented by RCP 8.5, which is the higher of the lines on the upper graphs there. I want to emphasize that we're not making a forecast of the future. The future is an uncertain place. The best we can do is to look at what it might look like under different assumptions, and that's what our models allow us to do, is to take different assumptions and say, if the world develops in certain ways, what are the logical implications of that, considering the interactions between climate, between water, between crop production, between markets, and so forth. So what I'll share this afternoon is one set of scenarios. Obviously, there are many others, and that's part of the challenge of the exercise, is to have an iterative process where we look at the results of certain scenarios. We try and understand where did those come from, how might those change if we had different starting conditions, and what can we do about that to improve the future that we'd all like to see. So one of the big drivers coming from growth in population and income is changes in diets. And it's not just population and income, but it's where people live, urbanization, globalization, all of these dimensions that affect how much we eat, what we choose to eat, and so forth. Here you can see by region in different time periods, 2010, 2030, and 2050, how the composition of diets is projected to change over time. With the bottom portion of each bar, the brownish part representing cereals, and then you can see other food groups as we move up the bars. In some regions in particular, on the far right, you see South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. We see significant increases in total consumption, 20 to 25% in those two regions, but also significant changes in the composition. Less growth in the staples, in cereals and roots and tubers, more growth in oils and sugars, fruits and vegetables, animal products in those two regions, in fact, almost doubling. And with the large population and the significant population growth in those regions, that adds up to large aggregate increases in total demand. So this shows for those same sets of commodity groups what the total global demand is likely to look like over the next 40 years under this particular set of assumptions about population and income growth. We can see almost a doubling in the case of oilseeds, slower growth again in the staples, cereals and roots and tubers increasing about 40 to 50%, with other commodity groups representing intermediate cases. So how will that demand be met? Here we show projected increases in production for the main cereal crops. And what you see first of all is the large round circle representing increased production of maize, around 500 million tons, which is about a 50% increase over current production levels. Smaller increases for wheat, rice, and the other cereals. But what's also important besides the size of those circles is their location. On the horizontal axis, we show increases in harvested area. On the vertical axis, increases in yields. And so if you look at the center of the circle representing maize production, you can see That corresponds to about 1.2 in comparison to today's levels. That means area harvested from maize will grow by a projection of about 20%. Likewise, on the vertical axis, we project that yields, global average yields for maize, will increase by about 40%. What's interesting to note for all of these crops is that those circles are located above the 45-degree line, which means that more growth in production is going to come from increased yields than from increases in areas. And that continues historical patterns over the past half century. Now that's the case for cereals, but it's a different picture for other commodities. In this case, the example of oilseeds. And we can see, again, very significant increases in palm oil production, and likewise in soybeans, lesser so for some of the other oilseeds, but interestingly located to the right of the 45-degree line. So relying disproportionately more on area increases rather than yield increases. And that obviously has important implications for land use change, for greenhouse gas emissions, and for the loss of other ecosystem services like biodiversity and so forth. So those so far are results without climate change, just assuming changes in prices or in market conditions, in technology and so forth. But we want to look then at the impact that climate change will have on some of those patterns. So we take the results from general circulation models. We can put those into crop models that look at how crops respond to changes in precipitation, changes in temperature, changes in solar radiation, and so forth. And those in turn can be used as inputs into global economic models, along with other assumptions about changes in demand and so forth. And this is one step in this process. This shows the potential impacts of climate change on rain-fed maize yields around the world. And what you see, first of all, of course, is a lot of red, showing potential significant declines in yields of rain-fed maize production around the world. But when you look more closely, you also see some differentiation. If you look at China, for example, you see in southern and eastern China that most of the coloring is red or yellow, indicating yield losses due to climate change. But if you go to the north and to the west at higher elevations and higher latitudes, you see the potential for improvement in maize yields. So diversity within individual countries. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, also quite a range from yellows, reds through yellows to some blue, as well as you go to different latitudes and different parts of the continent. What's important to keep in mind for this graph, these are what DSAT means. DSAT is a family of crop models. These are biophysical results before we consider the interactions of economic effects. So this is the first stage in the modeling process, before we consider economic adjustments. It's also one particular crop model from the Hadley Center in the UK, and it assumes a relatively high degree of climate change. So this is one step in the process, but we then put that into the impact economic model. We look at how supply responds, how prices respond, what that in turn means for changes in production behavior and production levels. And just summarizing again over different global regions here, what the gray bar shows in each case is the projected increase in yields for cereals as an aggregate between now and 2050 in the absence of climate change. And then the different colored dots from RCP 2.6, little climate change, to RCP 8.5, high climate change, those are how those yields are projected to change in each region. And you can see in most cases they result in a decline. There are a couple of exceptions, former Soviet Union and Europe at higher latitudes under these projections are estimated to actually benefit in terms of cereal yields from this range of climate change. Other regions hit more significantly. We can break that down and compare differences in individual crops. So here at the top you see maize more significantly affected, and if you find the bar towards the right, NAM, North America, that corresponds to the biophysical map that I showed in the previous slide. You can see quite significant impacts under higher levels of climate change, less so in some other regions, but a different picture for wheat, where in most cases the impact of climate change on yields is smaller, or in more cases actually some positive interactions as well. Although significantly farther on the right, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa continue to have adverse impacts of climate change on wheat yields. Let's look at the implications for prices as well. At the top bar here you see how prices of cereals could change under different assumptions. So the black line at the bottom of that gray cone corresponds to this middle of the road projections in terms of population and income, but without climate change. And we see increases in prices of about 20% in the absence of climate change. But depending on which climate scenario we look at and which climate model you use, those increases could double or triple in some cases with climate change. By contrast, on the bottom, without climate change, just looking at variation across different assumptions about population and income, we see smaller effects, plus or minus 50%, around that same 20% projected increase. That's the case for cereals as a staple crop. It's quite different for other commodities. For meat, for example, in the upper right, you can see much smaller implications for prices of climate change. And that's in part because as livestock feed, there are many different substitutes, different cereals that can be used. And as we have seen already in some of the preceding slides, different cereals have different implications or different climate impacts in different regions. And so there's the ability to substitute in feed means that less of that impact actually passes through to meat prices. Whereas in the lower right, you see that the population and income assumptions have a very large impact on meat prices, which is not surprising. That is, as a higher value food, something that really depends on demand changes as people's incomes grow. Trade is a critical factor even in the absence of climate change, but even more so with climate change. The gray bar represents current levels of either exports above the line or imports below the line in the absence of climate change. If you can make out the little black bars, those represent where we project trade could be in 2050 in the absence of climate change, and then the dots further make adjustments for what different climate scenarios might do to trade. So in North America, for example, we see trade exports increasing in the absence of climate change, with climate change still increasing, but to a smaller degree. If you look at, say, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa over on the right-hand side, we see that imports are projected to increase regardless of climate change. Whereas in regions like East Asia and Pacific on the left, Latin America and the Caribbean near the center, we see that the final impact on imports or exports actually depends on the climate scenario. There's enough range in those potential climate impacts that they could become bigger importers. They could actually remain on balance neither importers nor exporters, or in some cases slightly moving towards an export position, depending on the actual outcome of different climate scenarios. So one of my final slides here, looking then at the population at risk of hunger. FAO in its State of Food Insecurity reports estimates we have a little over 800 million people undernourished in the world today. Our projections show that moving from the gray line, today's situation, to the blue line in 2050 in the absence of climate change, significant improvement, cutting that number by about half, although most remain in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. But the final line there, the orange one, shows that some of those gains are reversed as a result of climate change. And particularly on the far right, you see in Sub-Saharan Africa, about half of the projected improvement is actually going to be lost as a result of climate change. And in total, about 50 million people we project are likely to be affected by climate change, where they would have been able to become food secure in the absence of climate change, but will remain food insecure as a result of climate change under this particular set of scenarios. So as I said at the beginning, this is not a forecast of the future. These are some projections about alternative futures depending on what kinds of scenarios and what kinds of assumptions we put into it. Those are critical because we can make a difference to what happens in the future. We've started looking at some scenarios about what happens with different types of investments in new crop varieties, in new production practices that allow us to increase yields, use resources more efficiently, improve incomes and food security. We're in the process of doing lots more of scenarios like this, looking at different policy options and so forth. And that's critical because, as I said, the future outcome is not something which is already determined. It very much depends not only on decisions we make in the future, but decisions that we make today. So I'd like to conclude just by noting that there are significant impacts at global regional levels, but those actually hide even greater impacts at the sub-regional, at the national, at the subnational level that are very critical. Importantly, the biophysical impacts of climate change are not the last word. Those are adjusted in turn by economic responses. And those economic responses further in turn depend critically on decisions that we make both today and in the future, that farmers make, that policymakers make, or that policymakers decide, that the private sector makes, and significant challenges at all scales. Most decision making is not made at the global level, but at the national level, at the subnational level, and that's why we want to turn next to looking at some particular national experiences in the Philippines and in Colombia to see how these types of issues are being addressed at the national scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. I'd like to introduce Mercedita Sombrilla, Director of the Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Environment Staff at the National Economic and Development Authority of the Philippines. Merci.
Thank you, Emil. Good afternoon, colleagues, and greetings from the Philippines, who is now experiencing El Nino, which is expected to become severe by Q1 and Q2 of 2016. Thanks to the organizer for inviting me to present this collaborative work that we have been doing with IFPRI, Economic Impacts of Climate Change in the Philippine Agriculture Sector, Scenarios, Policies, and Investments. This is a project which we undertook. It's one of the components of a study that we undertook with the fundings of the Climate Change and Agriculture Food Security, a research program of the CGIAR. This one, okay. Okay. I will do my presentation in 4 major topics: the rationale and objectives of this study, the methodology, which is already, in part explained by Keith before me, the impact of climate change on commodity production prices, food security, primarily in childhood malnutrition and hunger, economic welfare in agriculture, the economy-wide impact of climate change, and some key messages. In the midterm updates of our Philippine Development Plan 2010-2016, it is central, the twin goal of, inclusive growth and reducing poverty was very explicit in that midterm update. And to do that, we need to broaden our economic growth. And in broadening economic growth, agriculture still, plays a very major role, although it's already shrinking like in other countries. It plays major role primarily because of the, a huge portion of the labor force still, deriving their source of livelihood from agriculture. But it has been, on a downtrend, in the past 5 years. And to make it worse, climate change has been really, putting great pressure on further improving agricultural growth in the Philippines. So what we need is to develop adaptation policies and growth strategies for agricultural growth. And this was the primary rationale for doing this study with IFPRI to estimate the economic impact of climate change on Philippine agriculture, and through agriculture and the economy as a whole, examine the impact of climate change primarily on food supply, production and yield levels, and food prices, and indicators of food security, primarily number of malnourished children, population at risk of hunger and welfare measures, and economic benefits and costs to the full economy. And finally, one of the objectives would be to assess the effectiveness of alternative adaptation strategies, including the support for agricultural productivity growth and irrigation investment. Okay. So the methodology, as I said, was already partly described to you by Keith. It's a link modeling approach to assess the effects of alternative agricultural policies, technologies and investment, macroeconomic policies and institutions, climate adaptation strategies and agriculture under a range of climate and socioeconomic futures to assess the appropriate strategies for agriculture under a climate change scenario in the Philippines. And this is a summary of that link model. We have the general circulation model that will be providing projections of how the weather would like in 2030 and 2050, fed to the biophysical model, as Keith has already mentioned to you about. From that model, we determine the yield levels as they are affected by climate change. These yield levels will be inputted to impact, wherein food supply, food production, food consumption, different indicators of malnutrition, food security indices will, are projected. And then I think the addition in this link model is the development of the Philippine dynamic computable general equilibrium, so that we would know what would be the impact of climate change to the food economy. Okay. So let me discuss with you some of the key changes, some of the key results of this exercise. You can see on the board the changes of consumer prices of major agricultural commodities under a climate change scenario compared to a no climate change scenario in 2030 and 2050. And you can see and this is what I'm going to say are the averages of the different global circulation models. And you can see that all of the commodities, cereals, commodity prices for cereals, meat, root tubers, and fruits and vegetables are all increasing. For cereals, the commodity prices would go as high as 20% in 2050. Fruits and vegetables about 13%. Roots and tubers, 6%, pulses, 12%, and meat, 4%. And for the Philippines, which is very much, a rice-based economy, the commodity consumer prices for the rice prices would increase as much as 3%, corn, 6%, and wheat, 4%. Oh, no. Because of this, and the prices, the commodity prices are due to the yield declines. And yield declines that would, lead to commodity supply reductions. And with higher prices, because of the higher prices, producers are supposed to be encouraged to produce more. And this is already incorporated in the model. The net effect of a higher production due to higher prices, with the impact of climate change. And what I just mentioned to you about, the 3% rise, that's primarily on the per capita consumption of decline of rice because of the higher prices. And although the producers are going to, gain from higher production, most of the small farmers in the Philippines are net consumers. So in the end, they will be also suffering from higher prices due to climate change. Okay? And because of per capita consumption of primarily the basic cereals are going to decline, we are expecting, food security situation in the Philippines to worsen in 2030 and 2050. With climate change in 2050, there would be additional 70,000 children. This is a projected average across all the global circular models. 70,000 children, to suffer malnutrition with climate change. In terms of the number of people at risk of hunger, in 2030, there will be an increase of 1.4 million from about 15 million now. That's about 9% increase. And about 2.5 million increase in 2050, or 17% increase. The World Bank study have shown that malnutrition has there's a productivity cost of malnutrition. This is primarily due to loss of productivity, and it's estimated in the World Bank study that it's about more than 10% of the lifetime earnings. For an individual is lost because of malnutrition, okay? So in the Philippines, as I have already mentioned a while ago, the number of malnourished children due to climate change would increase to about 1.29 million. This would be equivalent per year to about $910 million, or about 41 billion per year, malnutrition cost to the economy. The next slide also shows the economic impact in agriculture due to climate change. And when we measure economic impact by, measuring the producer surplus, the consumer surplus, and the net welfare cost to the economy. And you can see the three bars at the rightmost would be the model average of all those global circulation model. And it says there that, in 2050, between 2010 and 2050, the net welfare cost to the Philippine economy would be about 16.7 billion. That would be roughly about $418 million per year. And that would be equivalent to about 19 billion pesos per year in the Philippines. And this is due to consumer surplus on a very, very negative level, which is about 71.7 million US dollars. As again, I said, even if the producers would be gaining from this, with climate change scenario because of higher prices of commodities, they are in the end net consumers of the commodities. So they would be also on the losing side. Okay, so and then, as I said, the impact model was connected to the Philippine dynamic CGE model to be able to determine what is the impact of the climate change scenario in the full economy of the Philippines. And you can see here on a positive side that there will be increases, higher growth or greater growth in agricultural production, primarily because of higher prices, higher commodity prices. But most of this growth will be coming from area expansion rather than productivity expansion. And on the downside, however, this would probably, slow down the structural transformation that is supposed to be happening in the country. Most of the low-skilled labor from the non-agricultural sector are going to move to the agriculture sector because of this, supposedly higher growth in agriculture. And that would provide a very negative effect to the industry and the services sector. And on the consumer side, because of this, the higher and the middle income consumers will have a reduced consumption, primarily because of reduced income. And but the increases in income in the agriculture sector because of the faster growth will not be able to negate the negative growth, negative income growth that will be coming from the industrial and the services sector. There will be a total of annual cost to economy of about 145 billion pesos due to climate change that would be coming from a negative private consumption and from negative investment. So the total welfare lost will be about 145 billion pesos. But there are several, technologies already that would counter the adverse effects of climate change. Technologies, farm practices that combine and optimizing fertilizer use, crop variety, and planting date under climate change, which can increase rice yields by about 11% and corn yields by 8%, is already, under experiments or even being undertaken in farms. There are more advanced technologies like, varietal traits like drought and heat tolerance that could increase, yields by 20%. And there are selective investment in cost-effective irrigation expansion increases that increases production and reduce vulnerability to climate change of agricultural production. And in our scenario building here, we use three types of adaptation strategies. The first one is to increase further rice productivity by continuing the rice subsidy, price subsidy on rice, that we provide to consumers and producers. A second strategy is an irrigation investment, and third strategy is an agricultural tariff reductions. Each adaptation strategies are assessed under a climate change with and without the rice self-sufficiency policy or the price subsidy policy. So you will be seeing in the next slide 6 scenarios. On the left panel would be, a climate change scenario with an NFA subsidy is still in place, or the price subsidy in place. And on the right panel would be a climate change scenario with the subsidy on prices already removed. And you can see that this subsidy, that, under a no subsidy scenario, all the private consumption, investment, government consumption, and total welfare will be, are projected to be much, much higher. Total welfare will be about 127.8 under an increased rice productivity strategy, 118.2 billion pesos per hectare under an increased irrigated area, use of investment in irrigated area, and agricultural tariff reduction would gain about 81.3 billion pesos per year under, under those scenarios. Okay, and this is primarily because, what we did in the project was to take investments from, that is supposed to be, the subsidies that NFA is giving to the consumers are much, much more, would provide more productivity enhancement measures if they were used on technologies that would really provide for productivity and increasing technologies in the agriculture sector. Plus, the subsidies have already giving wrong signals to producers. They are not able to make right decisions on where to really invest to increase their productivity levels. Okay, so what are the key messages here that we were able to get from out of this study? That climate change indeed would be very costly, not only to the agricultural sector but for the full economy. Costly in terms, it costs about 186 billion per year, 41 billion from increased malnutrition, and 145 billion from economy-wide losses. Climate change reduces crop productivity, increased food prices, and reduced food security, and it has a very large negative impact to the rest of the economy. But what can we do? Investment in increasing rice and other crop productivity growth, that would be the very key, I think, strategy that would be needed. This is, irrigation investments, especially irrigation, that are, strategically, located in the country, and removal of agricultural tariff. They show significant impact in reducing the negative impact of climate change. Reduction of expenditures and rice market interventions. You have noted on the projections about the NFA subsidies removed, that led to, greater social welfare, welfare to economic welfare. And supporting climate change adaptation policies, especially development of real-time weather information systems to support farmers' decision-making. The project that we have, NOAA, has been very, very useful in predicting, when typhoons come, and which makes people very much, prepared when, such disasters come along. Improve agricultural extension for the new technologies, climate smart technologies, and stronger seed industry to facilitate the adoption of new varieties. And a way forward would be to achieve food security under climate change, would be to shift the focus of policy to productivity and efficiency enhancing measures. Research and development still key to develop technologies appropriate for local conditions. The Philippines is very, very archaeologic, and so it's the landscape is very, very different. We need specific technologies for specific landscape. Irrigation and flood control development requires, one of the policies that we're going to be looking at is to reorient our food security policy towards facilitating rather than inhibiting trade, competition, and crop diversification to achieve inclusive access to food while generating long-term productivity and income growth. Our budgets in agriculture is still 55% rice-based. I think that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Alex Pinto, who's a senior research fellow at IFPRI. And you just click.
So our last presenter, Mercy, has already showed you how we can take global predictions and make them relevant at the country level. I want to do that even at a lower scale and bring it down to the landscape level. And I'll use for this two examples from two countries, Colombia and Vietnam. But before doing that, I wanted to make a point, which I think is sort of one of the overarching motivation behind our work, which is this idea that climate change forces both the researchers, but also the policymakers, forces us to consider a longer planning horizon. You know, the 5-year plan, the election cycle type of planning is really off the mark. So we need to really look into the future, 20, 30 years, but even longer. And that is particularly challenging. And in particular, this idea of pushing the planning horizon farther in time forces us to consider and to devise policies that are both economically and politically sustainable. That's important, politically and economically sustainable. So in order for these policies to be economically sustainable, well, a country doesn't live in isolation. A country faces the world market. You can insulate a country for only for so long time, but eventually you will face the world market. Therefore, in order to plan properly, you have to account for those forces that come from the global market. Also, politically, you want your policies to be politically sustainable. You want to have support domestically in order to have those policies to stay in place for a long time. And this is particularly true for mitigation policies, where often, the gains, particularly if you think about soil organic carbon, the gains can be acquired very slowly, but they can be lost very, very quickly. So you have to keep in mind this long-term horizon. And so all of this to say that you need to have the right tools to essentially to devise policies that lower the risk of crumbling under budgetary pressure and under political pressure in the long term. And it's really about searching for feasible options. I have a mental image for this, which I'm going to put on a slide here. The way I envision this is you see that there are global forces for change, and there are also the domestic plans for development. And at the same time, you have local realities, which are the real implementers. There are people who have to live the decisions made at the central level. And so the idea is to find this sort of sweet spot of the space of ideas where and options that are truly feasible in the long run. And how do you do that? Well, one of the problems and one of our challenges is to provide decision makers with the tools to devise and analyze these policies, to really to think about what are the feasible options for a country. And this is where the scales really come in. Because if you think about it, it's for many countries, we're talking about exogenous forces. It might be world market, it might be climate change, and all those forces really shape the space of possible policies, of viable policies, and at the country level. But then all of that trickles down to local realities. But then another important point is what happens once those local realities have adopted those practices. What does it mean for them? And what does it mean at the aggregate level? So you have to be able to go down the scale and analyze what it means for local actors, but then also you have to be able to aggregate all those individual decision makings and see what happens at the country level. So this is the importance of moving across scales. And this is we haven't finished completely the work of moving seamlessly across scales. but we are on that path. And the approach that we have taken is the idea of taking models that are capable of looking at the global market. They're really good at modeling what happens and creating scenarios for price changes, for area, agricultural area that has to provide a certain supply of food products, to take those global estimates and downscale them significantly to the country level and even lower in order to understand what it means for a country, for the different land uses, for the landscape. And so we connect these models, like the one that Keith has presented, Impact, that have this global vision, but they have a limited spatial resolution, and we connect them with models that are more linked to biophysical processes in order to understand at a more disaggregated level what it implies, what those long-term changes imply for a country. And so the essential components that we have put together is the impact model, and the impact model provides us with sort of plausible, and again, these are not forecasts, right? These are plausible scenarios for change in terms of changes in agricultural practices and changes in cropland, in areas, right? And then we use a spatially explicit model, an econometric model, to understand how those changes sort of play out at the local level, at the country level. We try to capture econometrically, statistically, what are the driver of land use choices, and then we take those changes and we probabilistically sort of spread those changes in a country to understand where the changes actually are more likely to happen. And this is essential, particularly when we think about mitigation and low emission development strategies, which is one of the examples that I'm going to show you. You need to know where those changes are happening. It's not enough to know how much agricultural area a country will have. You have to know where that change happens, because it might mean deforestation. It might mean that you have a different amount of land that goes into pasture land and in livestock production. All those things come with emissions and carbon stocks associated, and we need to keep track of those. And particularly to understand what those changes mean for crop production, food security, and emissions from crop production, we connect this, all this framework with crop model that essentially tells us, what happens to crops as you change weather, as you change soil conditions, as you change agricultural practices. So we're starting to have a pretty well disaggregated sort of series of analysis that allow us actually to simulate potential changes in agricultural practices, but also the effects of large-scale forces. So, as I said, the output is spatially explicit, so very disaggregated country-level results, but these results are connected with these large-scale forces that come from the global market. And what is the objective? Just to summarize, the objective for us is really to identify these viable economic development pathways, okay, which are consistent with the global markets, and to provide a decision tool for policymakers, to give them the tools to explore different policy options, to explore what is the viability of those policy options, okay? What are the economic implications? What are the emission implications, the changes in carbon stock implications, okay? And all of this accounting for all land uses, not just focusing on agriculture and agricultural land, but also accounting, as we will see, particularly for forests, where a lot of the changes might happen. And so I want to bring two examples, two countries that are on a very different trajectory in terms of emissions and, in particular, deforestation. I'm going to talk about Colombia and Vietnam. And these were very interesting countries, as I said, because they're on two different trajectories. In Colombia, if business as usual continues, it doesn't have to be that way, but if business as usual continues, there is a strong pressure for deforestation. Very strong pressure for deforestation. In Vietnam, it's actually the opposite. What we see, not just our modeling, but other modeling results, is that there's very little, if any, pressure for deforestation. In fact, in the Green Growth Plan that they have in Vietnam, and this is an official document, they want to increase the forested area to a total of 45% of total land area. And so they really have already done, and they have all intentions to continue doing a very good work in protecting the forest. And we have put together all this system to essentially simulate policy options. And so normally we meet with stakeholders. We have extensive meetings with all the people who might be interested in in either creating an INDC or even an understanding sort of what climate change might mean for them, but also how they could contribute or how they have to react to climate change. And we create this, we can simulate these broad targets, okay? Like in the case of Vietnam, say this idea of allocating, really increasing total forest area to a total of 45% of total land area. Or like in the case of Colombia, complete stop of deforestation in the Amazon, or reduce pasture land to a certain target, say 10 million hectares. These are numbers and these are scenarios that were suggested by by stakeholders in these countries. We didn't sort of create them by ourselves. And so these are broad targets for large land use changes, but we can also narrow sort of our analysis to something that is specific to agriculture, and this is more the case for Vietnam, and you will understand later why, but in Vietnam, a lot of the possible gains do come from what happens to crop production. And so in Vietnam, we analyzed the effect of alternate wet and dry in paddy rice, and the adoption of alternative fertilizers to urea. And so let me start with some of these results, just to give you a sense, a flavor of what kind of results we're getting and how useful these might be for policymakers. So this is for Colombia. And what you have on the screen is essentially, if you look at the upper left quadrant, okay, those are the win-win options. So we have simulated policies in Colombia, and the three policies that are here represented are a reduction in pasture, by 10 million and 5 million hectares, a complete stop of deforestation in the Amazon, complete stop, and 50% stop, and then increase oil palm area located to oil palm production by 750,000 hectares or 1.5 million hectares. These are big numbers. And so what you see here is that, so on the vertical axis are changes in revenues, and on the horizontal axis are changes in emissions. So the negative changes are what we're looking for, right? So that's a reduction in emissions. So the upper left quadrant is win-win solutions, okay? And then you have, which is essentially, they're represented by reduction in pasture. Then if you look at the results of forest, or reducing deforestation in the Amazon, you see that there is a trade-off. Now, actually, when you go and quantify the cost per ton of carbon that is saved, it's about $2–3 per ton of carbon, which is a good price. It's not very high. But still, there is a trade-off. And if you look at instead of what happens when you simulate, when you increase palm area to those large numbers, you see that it doesn't perform very well. Actually, there is room for expanding oil palm production, but you have to be careful. And you have to be careful because the transition that is often assumed, which is this transition from palm production into a very low producing and very inefficient pasture land, that transition doesn't happen that easily. And there are reasons. It is mostly because people use pasture land. They put area into pasture land as a way of controlling the land, not so much in looking for profitability. So this gives you, it really gives policymakers an idea of how these policies sort of compare and rank one against each other. They really give an overview. And in the second, and when I don't have results here, but in the second round of analysis, actually, we expanded the type of analysis, and in fact, that is some of the results that have been helpful for the Ministry of the Environment in producing the INDC in Colombia. I mean, I should say that one other message that it's clear here is that livestock and pasture land play a central role in terms of reduction of emissions in Colombia. You almost cannot do anything in Colombia in terms of significant amount of reducing emissions if you don't address the problem and all not the problems, but if you don't address the issue of livestock production and pasture land. Let me just point out what happens instead in Vietnam, and this is one of those cases in which really the connection with the global markets is essential. So this is one of the, Vietnam is a country that is very sensitive for lots of reasons, and some of them historical, very sensitive to food security, and particularly rice production. So they have this objective of keeping 3.8 million hectares allocated to rice production. Well, that, once you account for the opportunity cost of doing that, and what that would mean vis-a-vis the global markets, particularly considering the type, the quality of rice that Vietnam is exporting, okay, that doesn't seem to be a good idea. And because you end up actually, yes, reducing emissions, you have an increase in carbon stock, reduce emissions, but you also have a significant loss in terms of revenues. If you look at the bottom row, a different result you would have in the case instead of replacing urea with ammonium sulfate, which increase productivity, increase the efficiency of the use of input, and would actually reduce emissions, and increase total revenues. So again, a range of policies that can be explored and analyzed, which I think is essential for countries to really engage with carbon markets, would engage with emissions reductions, because countries need to know what their policy choices actually mean for the country. So what are the lessons learned? The first lesson, in my opinion, is that you can't focus just on agriculture when you look at emission reductions. And you need to consider all land uses. A lot of the gains or losses play out as an interaction with other land uses, this idea of the landscape level type of analysis. Actually, the best opportunities to increase resilience or to reduce emission might come by increasing the total performance of the system when you include crop production, degraded land, and forest together. When you look at the whole system together, that might increase resilience and reduce emissions overall. And so you don't ask farmers to do everything. You don't ask farmers to increase productivity, be resilient, and also reduce emissions. But you spread the achievement of those goals across different land uses. And in my opinion, what we have learned is that decision makers now do have the tools and the decision support tools to actually make decisions that are based on solid research. They're not left alone and just listening to powerful voices of lobbyists. Not that they shouldn't, but that's not the only voice. They can listen, and they have tools that come from the research community that can help them in making those decisions. But one thing, and this comes straight from the example of Colombia, what we have learned is essential that whatever we put together in terms of modeling capacity is that it has to be open, because you have to be capable of acquiring new data, and the data that is desirable by the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of the Environment and so on. So you have to be able to incorporate the data that is more suitable for the situation and for the country. It has to be transparent. It cannot be a black box. It has to be transparent because you have to gain the trust of policymakers. And it has to be adaptable because every country, as I showed, has a completely different either trajectory or different situation. And I'm done, but I wanted to make sure that I thank the whole team that has worked on this tremendous work that we finished in these two countries. And here is the list of their names. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I would like to invite the presenters now to the front, as well as our panelists. So if you could, our panelists are Dr. Kirit Shelat, the Executive Chairman of the Indian National Council for Climate Change and Sustainable Development, and Rodrigo Suarez Castaño, who's the Climate Change Director of the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. I have a few questions for you. I will start with Mr. Castaño, if that's okay. Stick around, it's going to be a lot of fun. So the Ministry of Environment in Colombia just completed the country INDC. Can you tell us more about your experience, about the method you followed, the political difficulties, what was helpful in formulating the INDC, and what you think it's still missing, and what you think would be helpful in terms of tools and knowledge to move forward? I know you have a couple of graphics that I can just put up while you speak.
Yes, so good afternoon. Maybe the next one, it will be easy. Yeah, that's right. And try to think in the middle one is going to be easy, but when Kit was talking, I thought that the best part is communication and language. And you were very clear with all the process that you have done in the global process. And my thoughts were, if I was Russia, it was like something was related with Russia. I said, okay, stop looking your neighbors, and the next process that you have to do is vodka, because it's going to be a lot of things related with climate change, with all the crops and that is going on in Russia. And so the process that we decide to do is, as Alex was telling, is trying to bring those circles in reality. So those with the global forces, so let's think in UNFCCC, that we take a decision that every country has to do an INDC. Then you said domestic plan, so we have to put it in place. And then we have the technical part to bring all the information to do our INDC. So if you look at the graphic that we have there, when you think in the government, we work in sectors. So we work in agriculture, mines, oil, on all of them. But when you think in the territory, you think that you have to put in place everything that you are thinking on as a sector. So we have to put together what's agriculture with the land use, and say our country is half forest. So we have to put together our INDC thinking in that. So our red strategy also, it has to be really important in all the process that we have been doing. So the first thing that is important, taking in consideration when we start building our INDC, is that we have to take a look in the regions, taking in consideration what we are thinking in sectorial policies. So what we decide is, first, as Alex will explain, the three models. The first one is that we can put all our scenarios for climate change in the model, but also all our information from Colombia, such as as you know, we are having a peace process. So it was really our information that we have to put there. What's going on if we have a peace process? We have some people who's living behind the forest right now. Are they going to be in the agricultural sector in a few months? So it's a big issue in our INDC. So we put all that information together, and then we have the other one, the spatial one, and the last one, the crops one, that it will really help us to take the decision of if our INDC is going to be the one that we need, if it's transparent, if it's balanced, if it's in all the process that it was in the decision of in Lima. So the first thing that I can say as a final thought is, first is the information, the importance of information, and how to bring the technical process to a decision, a political decision, and that's how we built our process in Colombia. And we bring all those information to the present level, and he understands clearly what's going to be our next step. And Alex was showing a little bit about sustainable process in some regions. And you were asking me also what's the next step that we have to do. I believe that we have to see it more in the regions. So, okay, so we have to understand what's going on in one region and then in another region, because it's not going to be the same in one region and another region, because all our country is going to have more temperature, but half of our country is going to have less precipitation, and the other one is going to have more precipitation. El Niño for you, I thought it is a lot of rain. For us, it's drought. So we have to understand that in our region, so how to deal with that. So more or less that's my thoughts about your question.
Thank you. Doctor, hi. India is currently under a lot of scrutiny given the current negotiations at COP and given the country position towards reducing emissions. What is it you experience at the state level at Gujarat, and with respect to climate change policies, and what do you think is still missing, if anything, in terms of information and or research that can help to develop sound agricultural climate change policies?
Well, thank you first for inviting me to be here. I like both the presentation and projection made by Keith and Philippines projection, but I would like to talk about what we did 15 years before in a province of Gujarat, state of Gujarat, and how we came out from these problems of challenges to the food security, or challenges to the livelihood, and increasing the growth. So Gujarat is a state which is situated on the northwest. It has all handicaps for agriculture because majority of area is rain-fed. We had a minus agriculture growth rate, sometimes 1% agriculture growth rate. In 2003, we assessed the entire Gujarat situation by going through variety of processes, and we identified certain key areas where basic correction in agriculture strategy were needed. Because we noticed that if we correct the agriculture strategy, agriculture structure of administration, and extension mechanism, and identify crops which are suitable, then things can change. So we introduced an approach called Krishi Mahotsav, which we call Festival of Agriculture. And this consisted of 4 important elements. First important element is to advise farmer, give agro-advisory of crops which can be sustained by his soil. And that was based on soil health analysis. So we introduced a massive soil health analysis program for each piece of land of farmers, and prepared by our agriculture university what crops will be sustained on based on soil and moisture content of that area. Second important area, we identified which crops will grow before simultaneously on such soils which have a higher volume and greater value. And therefore, the priorities of farmers were guided that, look here, these are the crops where you can get better income and better volume, and they will be sustained by your soil. Third important thing which we did was to identify the poor farmers who are already there. In India, we have poverty. Now, we had 90% people below farmers and rural area people below poverty line. When we became independent, it has come down now to 20%. But these 20% are vulnerable, so how to assist them? And they are smallholders. So what kind of quality input they need? What kind of seed replacement ratio they need? What kind of water management practices they need? And that was identified. Now this was backed up by a massive water conservation program. In 10 years, we constructed 100,000 check dams. So every drop of water in this dry land area which was dropping was preserved, and that increased sustainability of agriculture. Now, how did we this? We had a top to bottom and bottom to top approach. So Chief Minister, who is now Prime Minister himself, took the command of implementation of program or talking to the farmers in the first stage to know their problems. And this was driven then at district and block level by entire public administration system, which consists of both elected and non-elected member of administration. Along with scientists, the team of agriculture extension team, development team, went to each village. In 18,000 villages, there was visit by agriculture scientists prior to monsoon season to interact with farmer, to advise farmer what they can do, to understand their problem, to tell them about soil health analysis and provide them soil health analysis card, and also to provide inputs to 15 rural farmers below poverty line in each village, and this was done repeatedly year by year. And these changed from -2% or 1% to the agriculture growth of 8 to 12% in last decade and a half. And we have in Gujarat a sustainable agriculture which is growing. So what I am trying to say that it is right that climate change is there, climate impact is there. So we have to develop new models of providing farmers knowledge. But if farmers are brought into center and they are taken care of, we can definitely meet this challenge as we have done in Gujarat province of this thing. Along with this, I will take 2 minutes to describe a block of Dahod, which was poorest district in the country, and where there was 90% migration. And during this transformation and earlier effort with convergence of efforts, now there is 7% migration, greenery, and it is a tribal area with hilly region where changes have taken place. And individual farmers have increased their income, high-tech agriculture has come into force, rural youth have taken up to micro enterprises, and we are advocating multiple source of income to farmers. So if one fails, the other takes care of it. And as regards future, the initiative which are taken by government in relation are one important initiative is development of contingency plan. So when weather aberrations are taken place, contingency plan is prepared for every block. This is done by under National Initiative for Climate Resilient Agriculture. We have weather forecast advisory at block level now, which tells farmers what is weather aberration going to take place, and this is followed by agro advisory. And past the weather, the event has taken place, how to manage his crops. Another important area we are focusing now is to reduce losses of farmer from his doorstep or his farm to the market center, and we have measured losses from 4% to 20%. Now, if we reduce that losses, his income will increase and food security will increase. The other side, of course, is wastage by the urban consumer, and that is a bigger subject, and I am not getting into depth of it.
Thank you. Let me remind you all that the schedule has been moved back, so we still have 15 minutes here. So don't, if you're rushing to another session, it'll start 15 minutes after what it says on the schedule. I would like to ask a question to Dr. Rosegrant. You have a decade of experience working with research and policymakers. Do you believe that research outputs are sufficiently informing the negotiations? What is missing? What can or should the research community do better?
Yeah, I think, and I'll keep it really short so there's time to hear from you all. I think there does tend to be a disconnect not only here, but also in the work we do in all contexts, and I don't know if this is, you find this in your work, that the key is really to find your audience and to target it, but then also to partner with the right people. And as you saw, the discussions here today at this session are keyed mainly in a sense to global and to country levels. So for example, the kind of work that Keith's doing, we often work together with, for example, World Bank or Asian Development Bank or others, and work with them in terms of looking at the implications of these kinds of outputs for their investment policies or what they advocate in countries. The other kind of work, such as Mercy presented and Keith presented, and Rodrigo talked about also, are key directly with country policymakers. And for those levels, of course, in the first place, you have to work directly together with them. You have to, basically you have to be invited in, because, you know, if we just come in from outside and with a roadshow and present it, you're not going to get very far. But from working with them from the start of these projects, we can at least be heard. You know, of course, the final decisions are not ours at all, but we can work with them and trying to lay out the options. IFPRI also does a lot of work at a much more micro level, in household and village level. In fact, I can advertise there's a great session coming up in room 241 next on the common property rights and common futures that IFPRI has worked on together with the International Land Coalition and a number of other great partners, that shows that kind of micro level work as well. I think also as you move forward, we were pitched at a fairly technical level here, but as you work directly with groups within countries, you also have to then work at explaining better and clearly explaining the policy implications of what we do. And I think we did manage to get that out at the end of the talks as well, but that's something that always has to be kept in mind as well. So let's open it.
Yeah, if you'd like to ask any questions, there's a mic in the back, and there's, I don't know how we want to do this.
Just grab one right here.
Yeah. Oh. Let's.
Thank you very much. Asim Zia from University of Vermont. I have a question for Keith and Mercedita about very interesting modeling exercises, but I'm really concerned about the GCM projections are very smooth averages at very coarse scales, which are using as drivers of change, but they do not contain like extreme events like the floods and droughts, which would have like huge impacts on the agricultural productivity, as well as like ripple effects, cascading effects on the populations, like migrations or so forth. So how much certain you are in terms of these projections, because they seem to me like the underestimates and not really capturing the risk. Secondly, like the feedback effects, it seems to me your models are like really feed forwards from global to the local scale, but really the feedback effects that Alex talked about, like from local back up to those, could have also ripple effects on the prices and so forth. So those feedbacks could also be kind of like extenuate or like increase the risk as well. So what are your thoughts about those?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We don't, at this point, we don't incorporate those extreme events that you're talking about. So for example, what's going on in Southern Africa right now with drought alternating with floods, as you suggest, those are potentially much bigger drivers of production shocks, price shocks in any given year. And those are not currently incorporated in the model. We would like to do a better job of addressing those in the future, and we have some work underway to do that. But at the moment, the projections that we have are for expected levels of temperature, expected levels of precipitation in 2050. So they miss some important dimensions, as you say. We also don't consider things, we're not yet able to look at things like sea level rise or melting glaciers in the Himalayas. So there are a number of important dimensions that, as you say, would tend to make this, in some cases, an underestimate of the potential impacts. But admittedly, yes, those are important factors that we'd like to do better with. But also, just to make the more general point that this is one set of tools that we can use to inform, but for specific questions, we obviously have to complement it with other approaches as well.
Yeah, can I also speak the exercise that we did actually is sort of providing us an early warning, a tool that would help us prepare for incidences like this. It may not have, modeled a very extreme event, but indeed it provides us with some kinds of assessments of how strategies could be able to help us, mitigate the impact of extreme events, climate change. So, it's true that, it may not have contained all of these extreme events, but at least we get prepared. The policy decision makers are able to, have already some kind of insights of, even just a regular climate change could do to the economy. And that would, help them already get prepared with all those adaptation strategies.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Two very quick ones. We're at COP21. This is a policy dialogue situation that's probably unparalleled in our life.